As American settlers pushed westward, they inevitably came into conflict with native tribes that had long been living on the land. Although the threat of attacks was quite slim and nowhere proportionate to the number of US Army actions directed against them, the occasional attack, often one of retaliation, was enough to fuel fear of native peoples. Back east, the popular vision of the West was of a vast and empty land. But of course, this was an inaccurate depiction. On the eve of westward expansion, as many as 2,500,000 Native Americans representing a variety of tribes populated the Great Plains. Previous wars against tribes in the East in the early 19th century, as well as the failure of the earlier treaties, led to a general policy of removal of these tribes west of the Mississippi River. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 resulted in multiple forced removals, including the infamous Trail of Tears, which saw nearly 50,000 Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek people relocated to what is now known as Oklahoma. Building upon such a history, the US government was prepared during the era of Western settlement to deal with tribes that settlers viewed as obstacles to expansion. As settlers sought more land for farming, mining, and cattle ranching, the first strategy employed to deal with the perceived Indian problem was to negotiate treaties to move tribes out of the path of the white settlers. In 1851, the chiefs of most of the Great Plains tribes agreed to the first treaty of Fort Laramie. This agreement established distinct tribal borders, essentially codifying the reservation system. In return for annual payments of 50,000 to the tribes, as well as the hollow promise of non-interference from westward settlers, the participating tribes agreed to stay clear of the path of settlement. Due to government corruption, many annuity payments never reached the tribes, and some reservations were left destitute. In 1862, frustrated and angered by the lack of annuity payments, increasing hunger among their people, and the continuous encroachment on their reservation lands, Dakotas in Minnesota rebelled in what became known as the Dakota War or the War of 1862, that killed the white settlers who moved onto their tribal lands. Over 1,000 white settlers were captured or killed in the attack before an armed militia regained control. Hoping to forestall similar uprisings and all-out wars, the US Congress commissioned a committee to investigate the causes of such incidents. The subsequent report of their findings led to the passage of two additional treaties, the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie and the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek, both designed to move the remaining tribes to even remote reservations. The Second Treaty of Fort Laramie moved the remaining Lakota people to the Black Hills in the Dakota Territory, and the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek moved other tribal people to the region later known as the state of Oklahoma. The agreements were short-lived, however. With the subsequent discovery of gold in the Black Hills, settlers seeking their fortune began to move upon the newly granted Sioux lands with support from US cavalry troops. By the middle of 1875, thousands of white prospectors were illegally digging and panning in the area. The Lakota people protested the invasion of their territory and the violation of sacred ground. The government offered to lease the Black Hills or to pay $6 million if the Indians were willing to sell the land. When the tribes refused, the government imposed what it considered a fair price for the land, ordered the Indians to move, and in the spring of 1876 made ready to force them onto the reservation. In 1875, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills region of South Dakota brought prospective miners into the area and onto the hunting grounds of the Sioux Indians. The US Army responded to the pleas of the white settlers and miners for protection against the Sioux, and the Great Sioux War of 1876-77 erupted because of that. It was the last major conflict between the US Army and the Sioux tribe. In the Battle of Little Big Horn, perhaps the most famous battle of the American West, a Lakota chief, Sitting Bull, urged Native Americans from all neighboring tribes to join his men in defense of their lands. At the Little Bighorn River, the US Army's 7th Cavalry, led by Colonel George Custer, sought a showdown. Driven by his personal ambition, on June 25, 1876, Custer attacked what he thought was a minor encampment. Instead, it turned out to be a large group of Lakotas and other Indian tribes. The warriors, nearly 3,000 in strength, surrounded and killed Custer and 262 of his men. This was the single greatest loss of US troops to a Native American force in the era of westward expansion. Now we will talk about the ghost towns. Because forced assimilation had nearly destroyed Native American culture, some tribal leaders attempted to reassert their sovereignty and invent new spiritual traditions. The most significant of these was the ghost dance, which was pioneered by Ovoka, a shaman of the northern Paiute tribe. The ghost dance ceremony would reunite the spirits of the dead with those of the living, and the power of these spirits could be harnessed in battle with the white settlers and the US Army. Though the practice of the ghost dance originated with the Paiute tribe of Nevada, it quickly spread to other Indian tribes in the southwest. Wovoka's most influential prophecy was that the white man would be forever banished from the land and that the buffalo, which had been hunted to near extinction by the white settlers, would return and bring with it a lasting revival of the Native American way of life. Wovoka and his co-stars triggered one last wave of resistance to the encroachments of white settlers and their way of life. Chief Sitting Bull, who had led the Sioux to victory over the US Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment at the Battle of Little Bighorn, embraced the co-stars and helped facilitate its spread throughout the Sioux Reservation. On December 15, 1890, police officers who feared that Sitting Bull was about to flee the reservation with adherents of the co-stars shot and killed Sitting Bull. The final episode in the so-called Indian Wars occurred in 1890 at the Wounded Knee in South Dakota. On their reservation, the Lakota people had begun to perform the ghost dance, and the white settlers began to worry that another uprising would occur. The 7th Cavalry prepared to round up the people performing the ghost dance. Frightened after the death of Sitting Bull at the hands of tribal police, a group of Lakota ghost dancers led by Bigfoot fled. When the 7th Cavalry caught up to them at Wounded Knee, South Dakota on December 29, 1890, the Lakotas prepared to surrender. Although the accounts are unclear, an apparent accidental rifle discharge by a young Lakota man preparing to lay down his weapon led the US soldiers to begin firing indiscriminately upon the Native Americans. What little resistance the Lakotas mounted with a handful of concealed rifles at the outset of the fight diminished quickly. The troops eventually massacred between 150 and 300 men, women, and children. The US troops suffered 25 fatalities, some of which were the result of their own crossfire. Captain Edward Godfrey of the 7th Cavalry later commented, and I quote, "I know the men did not aim deliberately and they were greatly excited. I don't believe they saw their sight. They fired rapidly, but it seemed to me only a few seconds till there was not a living thing before us." End of quote. The United States awarded 20 of these soldiers the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military honor. With this last show of brutality, the Indian Wars came to a close. The US government officials had already begun the process of seeking an alternative to the meaningless treaties and costly battles. A more effective means with which to address the public perception of the Indian problem was needed. Americanization provided the answer. In 1870, Congress supported assimilation with $100,000 appropriation to establish federal industrial schools, mainly on existing reservations. These early efforts often failed, both because Indian parents resented efforts to dismantle their cultures through their children and because students simply ran away. Administrators then replaced reservation-based day schools with remote boarding schools, separating children from their parents. Industrial education for Indians drew support from the notion of social Darwinism and from the efforts of pragmatic reformers in American South such as Samuel Armstrong. Armstrong had advocated the development of trade skills as a mechanism for gradual assimilation of freed slaves. In 1879, 84 Lakota children became the first students at the Carlisle, Pennsylvania Indian Training School. Their education there marked the beginning of a generation-long effort to assimilate Indian children coercively in 81 schools from Carlisle to Riverside, California. Carlisle School founder Richard Henry Pratt studied the Hampton model as he developed his ideas for an Indian school system. Separation from parents was the first step in a process that isolated Indian children from their culture and traditions. At the schools, teachers then gave children new names and clothes, uniform for boys and long dresses for girls. The setting, lifestyle, and curriculum were designed to teach Indian children to conform to the ways of the white world. At Carlisle, Pratt told arriving students and visitors that he would, and I quote, kill the Indian to save the man. By 1900, the United States government had spent almost $300,000 on Indian boarding schools. Despite these numbers, the assimilation through education experiment failed to destroy Native American culture. Indian schools created a generation of students who returned home as agents of cultural change with valuable knowledge about the workings of white world and a new awareness of collective Indian identity that fostered a more united Indian civil rights front. But others, too white to be red, too red to be white, left the schools with no real cultural identity and little chance for success in either world. The United States government also facilitated the process of assimilation by passing off various acts. The Dawes Act of 1887 was passed on January 8. The act authorized the president to confiscate and redistribute tribal lands in the American West. It explicitly sought to destroy the social cohesion of Indian tribes and to thereby eliminate the remaining vestiges of Indian culture and society. Only by disavowing their own traditions, it was believed, could the Indian ever become truly Americans. Initially, the Dawes Act did not apply to the so-called five civilized tribes. Those were Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. They had already adopted many elements of American society and culture, which is why they were characterized as civilized. Moreover, they were protected by treaties and had guaranteed that their tribal lands would remain free of white settlers. However, after they had proven unwilling to voluntarily accept individual allotments of land, the Curtis Act of 1898 amended the Dawes Act to apply to the five civilized tribes as well. Their tribal governments were obliterated, their tribal courts were destroyed, and over 90 million acres of their tribal lands were sold off to white Americans. Further, inefficiencies and corruption in the government meant that much of the land due to be allotted to Indians was simply deemed surplus and claimed by settlers. Once all allotments were determined, the remaining tribal lands, as much as 80 million acres, were sold to white American settlers. Now we will talk about the impact of westward migration on environment, and we will talk particularly about the decline of buffalo population. In the United States, the destruction of buffalo changed ecologies and economies. Alongside government policies for war or peace and the education or removal, a contest over animals and land greatly influenced the traditional tribal life for the Plains Indians. Economic and environmental forces linked with changing perceptions of the natural world undermined the ability of Indians to use natural resources that had supported them abundantly for thousands of years. On the plains of the 1870s, open range cattle drives, an expanding web of rail lines, hunting, environmental factors, and politics contributed to a rapid decline of the once vast herds of American buffalo. For the Plains Indians, buffalo provided food and shelter, dictated tribal migration patterns, served as a vital trade commodity, shaped diplomatic relations between tribes, and played a central role in culture and religion. For millennia, more than 24 million buffalo had migrated seasonally throughout the plains and valleys west of the Missouri River. In the 1840s, the ability to use horses and steel to harvest the buffalo helped Comanches to forge an unprecedented empire covering 6 US states and several Mexican provinces in the 1840s. Between the 1830s and 1870s, however, the herds that had moved over the land like the shadows of scudding clouds began a dramatic decline towards near extinction. Indians and white people first observed significant declines in buffalo numbers, especially on the northern plains, before the Civil War. Observers also noted starvation and new migration patterns along Indian peoples of the upper plains. The decimation of the great buffalo herds began with Indians caught in convergence of ecological, political, and economic change. In the decades before the Civil War, some plains tribes resolved old tensions and forged new alliances to cope with migrant encroachment on tribal lands. Indians were simply not caught up in global changes of land use facilitated by the Industrial Revolution. They were also, as they had always been, agents of environmental change. Between 1840 and 1870, facing increasing waves of migration and infiltration of their hunting grounds, Indians participated in the growing hide trade while maintaining traditional hunting practices. The interplay of migrant intrusion, tempting market forces, US Army aggression, and new Indian alliances that freed time and resources for hunting all contributed to buffalo's decline. For buffalo hunting Indians, the true crisis came in the 1860s and 1870s, when the Transcontinental Railroad enabled mass hunting and an international hide trade. Mechanizing industries used leather hides for machine bells, and high demand caused shortages. Factory owners imported tanned hides from South America but longed for a cheaper substitute. Entrepreneurs developing new methods of tanning buffalo hides created a better product at less cost. Buffalo hunters then followed the rails, and new train lines carried the hides to factories of the East. Legendary hunters such as Buffalo Bill were credited with killing thousands of animals a day. Though the numbers were often exaggerated, between 1865 and 1883, hide hunters did kill vast numbers of buffaloes and pushed the already declining population to the edge of extinction. Killing from slowly moving trains with high-powered rifles, hunters then skinned the animals and left their huge bodies to rot. Military leaders, understanding that the destruction of the buffalo crippled Indians who depended on them, encouraged the slaughter.